If you haven't noticed or you've entered the presentation a little bit later, I have posted in the chat that we are recording today's session and will make it available for you to view at a later time on our YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Fiona Byrne from Casa's Stakeholder Engagement Group, and I will be joined by our team of experts from Airworthiness and Engineering Branch, Ben Challender and Mick English. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Could everybody please turn their cameras off and mute themselves? So before we continue, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today and their continuing connection to the land, water and community, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are participating today. Now, as I mentioned a little earlier to Peter, I will call for questions after Ben's presentation, but feel free to start popping your questions into the chat before then. If you're not quite sure where the chat icon is, it's at the very top of the screen. So today we've set aside an hour, but if needs be, we can stay on the line for a little bit longer, but we'll just see how we go. So today, Ben will cover understanding the rules, the impact of the new rules, providing your feedback via the consultation hub and what the emerging themes are so far, the implementation and transition to the new rules. So without taking up much more of your time, I'll hand over to Ben and he will take you through probably a 20-minute presentation and then we'll open up for questions. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Fee. And thank you all very much for being with us today. We definitely appreciate the time that you take out of your busy days to help us make the proposed regs even better. We're going very well in our consultation. It's been open for a few weeks now. Very positive comments from most people in industry. See a lot of benefits, think that we're heading in the right direction. So we're very optimistic that it's all coming together very nicely. So as Fee said, I'll run through a very quick presentation, just trying to hit the highlights of what we set out to achieve, what we've done so far, some of the key policies, a little bit of a summary of some of the effects. It's obviously very high level, so I hope that you understand and take it in that spirit. There is a lot of documentation that we have produced in our website, which is available for all of you to read. I'd suggest you start with the Plain English Guide. It's an excellent document that's getting a lot of good reviews from people. It outlines pretty much everything most people need to know about the new rule set and what it means for them. And it means that you don't have to spend hours trying to analyse the legislation itself. Obviously, we have draft legislation as well and encourage you to read that and provide your comments, particularly if you see any potential issues, errors, unforeseen consequences, those kinds of things that we certainly try to avoid, and it's one of the main reasons why we do consultation of draft legislation. If you're looking for a little bit more information on specific subjects, there's also some draft advisory circulars and a range of other things like information sheets that are specifically targeted around functions and authorisation kinds of people in industry. So in a nutshell, lots of information, but you don't need to read it all. And we would certainly encourage you to provide any comments, input, feedback via the consultation hub. All right, so in terms of the presentation, this diagram that you should be able to see in front of you is a simple graphical representation of how we are trying to build the Casa regulatory framework. It is meant to be risk-based, framed and aligned around the new flight operations regulations. So I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the old categories of operations, RPT, charter, aerial work, private. The new flight operations regs, which started last year, are in place now. They are the foundation of the risk-based framework that we are aligning with. Most importantly, Part 43 does not have any effect on the air transport operational sectors. So it is framed around what was traditionally known as private and aerial work. In the new terminology, that includes a range of other things like flying training, aerial applications, parachuting, the recreational activities under warbirds, a whole lot of things that were predominantly grouped under aerial work in the past. Also important to understand is that it's quite possible for aircraft that are certified in the transport category to operate under private or aerial work operations, and also for aircraft that are certified in the normal category to be used for air transport operations. So whilst there is a hard line in terms of what the aircraft is used for and its applicability under Part 43, aircraft that are certificated in the transport category remain under Part 43 if they are only used for private and aerial work. But there are some additional step changes in Part 43 to make sure that larger, more complex aircraft and complex maintenance of things like overhauls of turbine engines, they're not subject to the same rules as your small, private, simple aircraft, even within Part 43. The other issue that has been one of our primary concerns as we've been developing these rules is, well, what do we do to manage the aircraft that can be used in Part 43 or in air transport operations? So in a nutshell, the answer is we manage that exactly as we do now. It's quite possible for your standard category C of A aircraft to be operating for years under the CARS, subject to Schedule 5, fair bit of maintenance being done by independent lamies. All of those kinds of things are very common now. If somebody wants to use that aircraft for an air transport operation, they have to make sure that the aircraft is being maintained to the airworthiness regulations that apply to that aircraft in the air transport sector. If that means they're moving up to the old RPT, now scheduled air transport, that means that they need to be doing things like an airworthiness review, making sure that they're getting the right maintenance providers, which for the most part is a Part 145 maintenance organisation. All of those things associated with transitioning aircraft across sectors are done now, are done safely now. So we don't consider that a significant risk in this context, but it is something that needs to be understood by us as we develop the regulations and you as you use these regulations in the future. All right, Fee, let's move on. Okay, so when we set out on this latest iteration of the general aviation maintenance rules being transitioned from CAR to Casa under our very long-running regulatory reform program, basically, we took everything that we've learned over the last 20 years and started with a fresh approach. So I came on board in Casa about 10 years ago, just as we were consulting a potential EASA-based GA regulatory framework. We did a roadshow, talked to a lot of people who pretty much said, we don't really think that's appropriate for Australian GA. why don't you go back to Canberra, have a think about it, and come back with something that looks more like New Zealand or the US FARs? So, of course, we did that. We relaunched this project about 3 years ago, engaging directly with people like you around the kinds of things that we should be considering, other countries that should be used as a baseline for the new regulations. And that first round of consultation came back with a pretty convincing, let's look at the FARs, and New Zealand's pretty good too. So that was the foundation for our work. We have progressively analysed and developed Australian policies and now draft legislation that is based on the US FARs. So it's not a direct copy. There are a range of reasons for that, not least being we're not a US state. We do need to make sure that Australian regulations work in the Australian regulatory framework. We're not changing everything. So we are not adopting a US AMP licensing framework. So amalgamating the US FARs with the current Casa Part 66 licensing framework was a significant challenge. There are a range of other things that have come up through consultation that we've also accepted. So yes, based on the FARs, but not a copy. Fee, moving on. In terms of the objectives, so what we are trying to do, similar to that diagram at the start, is make a scalable and proportionate regulatory framework. In particular, focusing on reduced administration for the smaller, simpler, lower risk aircraft that are commonly used in the GA sectors. So this is not about reducing safety standards. It's aimed deliberately at reducing costs, in particular around administrative costs. We're also very mindful that the Australian GA environment, particularly outside of the key areas down in the southeast, as you move further north and west into more remote and rural areas, the paradigm changes. We need to be mindful of how the regulations affect people and businesses in those remote and regional areas, and we have been very mindful of that, and we're getting really good feedback from people out in those areas that these rules will be a much better fit, particularly in relation to scenarios where there are good people, good facilities, potential operations that can be done out in those areas, but the business model just doesn't line up when you have to sink money into administrative overheads associated with organisational approvals. Fee, next one. So in terms of what this will mean, what are the main changes? The most significant one is that we are moving away from a framework that is framed around maintenance organisations. We are the only country that we benchmark against that requires maintenance organisations right down to the bottom of small, simple aircraft used in private operations. So when we, as the regulator, do our benchmarking, we look around the world, that is a significant difference between what we have and what other countries that, depending on your point of view, of course, have a more vibrant GA sector. So that's a key change. It's not to say that maintenance organisations cannot be used and are not required in some circumstances under Part 43, but for your average small, simple aircraft used for private and aerial work, they will not be the primary requirement. More flexibility for LAMEs. So LAMEs, obviously, given that the reduced focus on maintenance orgs, are at the forefront of Part 43. So contrary to what some people have read into the rules, this is actually about empowering LAMEs, providing more flexibility, enhancing business opportunities for small businesses framed around a LAME with their license. So type ratings, a significant administrative cost, but equally a very good safety feature that has worked for many years. So type ratings, similar to maintenance orgs, still available, still a very good way to get very broad privileges very quickly. But if a business wants to move into working on type rated aircraft, but not necessarily providing a full suite of type rated maintenance for those aircraft, LAMEs can work in that space by incrementally expanding their privileges based on local demonstration of competence. So a significant cost benefit for regional areas that it's really hard to justify dropping tens of thousands of dollars on people having to travel to Australian capital cities or the US or Europe to do type rating training courses under a formal training arrangement. Some other more administrative things, the Australian maintenance release, obviously maintainers and operators need to be communicating with pilots. They will no longer need to use the Casa Form 918, but they will still need to do something equivalent. If they want to use Form 918 to do that, they can. So overall, what we're looking at is a more outcome-based, more flexible framework that takes advantage of lots of good things that we've been doing for many years, but providing additional flexibility for the GA sectors. Fee, next one. Actually, while Fee's changing that, a good point to bring up, because a lot of people ask questions around it, is we are moving away from those Australian unique ADs that are misaligned with what an AD is meant to do. An AD is meant to address design and manufacturing issues that affect a type. We in Australia have used ADs for many years to supplement the maintenance regs because of real or perceived deficiencies in the regs, specifically a lot of them framed around Schedule 5. So a lot of those generic maintenance ADs like AD-Eng 4, AD-Eng 5 will be repealed for Part 43 aircraft, but it's not because we are looking to remove the effects of those ADs. So AD-Eng 5, there's ironically for an AD, there's a lot of flexibility provided to industry in AD-Eng 5. That flexibility has been built into Part 43, so we don't need an AD to provide industry that flexibility. What's new? I have covered most of that, but the underlying point there is really significant. So Part 43 is a simpler framework that is based on a range of similar concepts like annual reviews, annual inspections. The difference between the Schedule 5 annual inspection and the Part 43 annual inspection is Part 43 is framed around the fundamental safety standards of an aircraft, which are in Part 21. Many years ago, when the regs were written, the links between Part 21 and the aircraft certification basis and the continuing airworthiness of an aircraft were lost. So what Part 43 does is it re-establishes those links. So when a LAME does an annual inspection, the basis of their inspections and the subsequent release to service is that the aircraft complies with its certification basis. For decades, we have not trained LAMEs in that space. So in order for a LAME to make that declaration, we need to make sure that they have demonstrated competency in that space. And that brings with it a new kind of authorization called an inspection authorization. And in order for a LAME to get that, they need to do a training course, which is run by Casa, that basically trains them in relation to understanding the certification basis of an aircraft and what an inspection against that certification basis means. Once they've passed that exam, they can then go out and do the annual inspections. Next one, Fee. A lot of stuff obviously stays the same. It's maintenance of aircraft. So yeah, the basics are still there. Tools, data, facilities, the more tangible rules around how a person does maintenance, they stay the same. So all of the performance rules are exactly the same as you will see across any reg set in Australia, Part 43, Part 42, the CARS, US, New Zealand, all of those things, the same. In order for anybody to be doing maintenance, they need to have the required tools, data and facilities. Maintenance records, obviously, still required, and primarily, the registered operator remains responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft. A fundamental international concept that remains the same under Part 43. We see this as a good opportunity for us to be re-engaging with the registered operators who, generally speaking, are not knowledgeable in relation to airworthiness, but they are responsible for the aircraft, and engaging maintenance providers and communicating with their pilots and people who use the aircraft. So that responsibility remains same as it is now. Next one, Fee. Implementation. So there are a lot of benefits for industry in these new rules. We're therefore looking to bring those benefits to life as quickly as we can. Things that facilitate the new arrangements will be available as soon as possible after the rules are made. Things like when a person can get an inspection authorization, when a person can transition from the car rules to these rules. They are available as soon as we possibly can make them, but equally we're trying to balance that with existing businesses. So there are a lot of like 500 odd Car 30 maintenance organisations out there now active in this space operating safely. So we're providing extended transition times for existing businesses so they have time to transition gradually into these rules, make good business decisions about how they're going to be functioning in the future. In terms of timeframes for making the rules, still very confident that the rules will be made this year. I was down in Adelaide yesterday. A lot of businesses down there really saying, what's taking Casa so long to get this done? Because it's obvious that it brings forward a lot of good benefits for the GA industry. So we're doing everything we possibly can, but I can't promise a specific time frame. I can only promise our best efforts to get this over the line. Next one, Fee. Consultation is now open. So I would encourage all of you to get on the website. The more information we get from real people like you around how this will affect you in the real world, the better we can make the regs. So please get online. There are some predetermined questions for you to answer, and there is also a generic free text area for you to provide comment on anything that comes across your mind as you're reading the documents. So don't feel constrained by the questions. We do read all of the free text fields, and we do try to engage with you if those are bringing new issues to light. Next one, Fee. What we've seen so far, overall very positive. This is the first time in a long time that I've heard people complimenting the new draft legislation as simple and clear and digestible for normal people. So that's great. In terms of the more technical issues, that issue of cross-sector operations has been an ongoing theme of comments from people. I'm a registered operator. I want my aircraft to be available for air transport operations and aerial work operations. What does that mean for me? Right, so a lot of that, like I said before, existing processes. You as the registered operator are responsible for making sure your aircraft complies with the rules that are applicable to the operations it will be carrying out. You don't need to do anything differently in that space. Use your existing processes to make sure that your aircraft complies with the applicable rules. We've got an information sheet on that to provide people some guidance in that in a more technical, descriptive sense. Next one, Fee. There are quite a few people who are concerned about the additional flexibilities that are available for LAMEs. Fortunately, less people who are concerned than people who see this as a good and welcome benefit. It is a known fact that Part 66 is a difficult area of legislation. It is very complex. It is administratively intensive. It's not well understood by a lot of people who transition from Car 31. It's not as flexible as Car 31. So we know that. We've been working on a range of enhancements for Part 66. In simple terms, what we're doing is we're working a range of things in parallel. So Part 66 is about how you get your license. We're working on a range of flexible options there in terms of better ways for people to get licenses, more flexibility for people who have licenses. Part 43 is more in that second space. Part 43 does not affect how you get your license, but it provides considerable flexibility for what you can do with it after you've got it. So yeah, if you're interested in other initiatives we're launching in the Part 66 space, look at our GA work plan and our Part 66 webpage. We are becoming increasingly active in that space as well. AMTC, so for those of you who are active down in the GA sectors, you'd be aware that as well as LAMEs, there are a range of other maintenance permissions. Things like maintenance authorities, airworthiness authorities, Car 42 ZC6 permissions. People are using those now safely. So we have a new concept under the Part 43 rules called an Aircraft Maintenance Technician Certificate, which is really framed around carrying those existing safe, good, proportionate maintenance permissions across into the new world. IAs, a lot of questions about IAs, a lot of information online. As I said before, it's framed around just bridging that competency gap between what a person learns when they set out to become a LAME and understanding the aircraft certification basis. So if you're interested in that space, please get online, have a read. If you've got any questions, let us know. We are working towards having that up and running as soon as the regs are made. We have draft training courses and guidance material forms already in preparation. And lastly, but most importantly, there are still some people who are concerned about safety. So obviously that is paramount in our thinking. We take a great deal of confidence from the fact that the FARs and FAR-based systems are common around the world. They are a fundamentally safe regulatory scheme. It's our responsibility as the regulator to make sure that we transition from our existing safe arrangements into a future safe arrangement. So we are stepping up our work on transition and implementation to make sure that we don't fall backwards and we do actually get the safety outcomes that we know you can get under a FAR-based rule set. All right, so that's the high-level presentation. Please take this opportunity to answer questions, to ask questions. We'll do our best to answer them. And if you are more inclined to write them down, we will do our best to answer them today or get back to you afterwards. So over to you, Fee.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. As I said before, we do have large numbers today, so to ensure that everyone who wants to ask a question has the opportunity to do so, I ask that you initially limit your questions to no more than 2. If it's easier to ask your question rather than type it in, please raise your hand for me. To do this, just hover over the reactions icon at the top of the screen and choose the raise your hand option. But please don't forget to put it down, because I could keep coming back to you to ask another question. We still have a good half an hour. So if you do ask a question and we've run out of time, as Ben said, we'll take it on notice and endeavour to respond to you as quickly as we can. So I will just check the, oh, there's a hand up, but I'll just go with the question that's in the chat at the moment. Ben, I might direct this to you initially, and then maybe Mick might be able to add to it. With regards to Schedule 5, generic maintenance schedule, can this be applied to smaller air transport aircraft or only private and aerial work aircraft?
Right, so Schedule 5 is obviously the existing arrangement. Many of you would probably know that it was designed around a concept of aircraft that are no longer supported by the type certificate holder. It's really good at that. Unfortunately, it was applied generally. So whilst it works, it's really been taken outside its design parameters, and there are a lot of questions that it has raised over the years. Part 43 retains a very similar principle. Annual inspection and 100 hourlies are done in accordance with the inspection schedule, which is in Schedule 1 of the Part 43 MOS. That schedule is more outcome-based, but broader than Schedule 5. That Schedule 1 of the MOS is available to most small, simple aircraft under Part 43. It is not available to any aircraft that is used in air transport operations. So in reality, what that means is, if you want to take your aircraft up to Part 42, you're subject to Part 42 rules, which does not have a Schedule 5 equivalent. If you want to use your aircraft for non-scheduled air transport, using the old terminology charter, Schedule 5 is still available for your Class B aircraft doing charter. Nothing changed. Part 43 does not affect charter aircraft at all. Under Part 43, the Schedule 5 equivalent, Schedule 1 of the MOS, is available, generally speaking, to your smaller, simpler aircraft. Mick, do you want to jump in here and explain the differences between the Schedule 1 of the MOS and the progressive inspection schedules?
Sure. Am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Good. Schedule 1 is an all-in-one hit thing. It's just, and it can be used for the annual inspection or for the 100 hourly. The only difference there, just to digress a bit, is that if the Schedule 1 is being used for an annual inspection, Section 13 of the schedule is included, which is a document review to ensure that the aircraft continues to conform to its certification basis and that all relevant AEDs and airworthiness limitations have been complied with. Now, the progressive inspection is basically Schedule 1 spread out over a period of time. It can be spread out over 12 months. We actually took the old progressive inspection from Casa Schedule 5 because it is a good, simple and easily worked progressive schedule. So they can both be supervised by an IA. In fact, an IA must supervise a progressive inspection because it's only available for an annual. Any further information required by anyone? No? Good.
Okay, we'll go to the next question. Now, there's two people patiently waiting with their hands up, so I'll go to the first one. Chris, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you. My understanding in regards to AMTCs, that Part 43 allows for doing a task once to equal competency. A pilot who does his first solo, I don't class as being competent, and someone who times the magnetos once, I don't believe is competent. US FAR 43 has a higher hurdle for competency. is there any chance that Casa will look at this low bar that's being set or proposed in Part 43 at the moment?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Chris. So it's not quite as simple as what you have described there. The person has to have the underpinning license competencies, right? So that's not something that's available to just anybody, and it's not really framed around the AMTC. So we're sort of mixing concepts there. Task-based incremental expansion of privileges is primarily framed around LAMIs who already have an underpinning competency. So we have sought to replicate the FARs in relation to that scenario for license holders. If you're familiar with the FARs, you would know that they don't have type ratings at all. It's not a concept that they use to regulate. They use that framework where a license holder demonstrates their general competency and then they expand their privileges based on demonstration of competency in the local environment. So that's the high level description. Did you want to get into more specific detail than that?
What does the AMTC require then for to gain competency?
Right, so there are 5 different categories of AMTCs with different intent around those. So Mick, did you want to jump in and describe the AMTCs?
Sure. The AMTC 1, which is the subject of this question, it's intended to be available. So if somebody already has a welding authority and they want to be able to continue exercising the privileges of that authority, we can give them an AMTC 1 of the equivalent scope and privilege. If somebody has a Car 30 approval at the moment to do, say, overhaul of hydraulic components, and they don't want to go up to a Part 145, we can give them an AMTC 1 to allow them that same scope of privilege as they would have had under the Car 30. There are a few examples. NDT, if you meet the NDT qualifications, we can give you an AMTC for that. And specialist maintenance. I'm trying to think of maybe a specialist timber aircraft repairer or a composite maintenance person. They could get an AMTC for doing that sort of specialised work. It'll be based on, it has to be based on established competencies. In other words, they've got a qualification to show that they've done it, or they're capable of it, or they have completed, can show completion of a relevant course.
So just to close off on that one, Part 43 is a competency-based system. So there are a lot of people who are concerned about different ways that we're introducing to demonstrate competency. The stuff that Mick described there around AMTCs, it's roughly equivalent to what we already do now. Just a lot of people who aren't active in that space don't know about it. We are introducing more flexibilities for LAMIs, but it's not a Casa thought bubble. This is a tried and tested scheme that's used in other countries very successfully. So it is a good system. It is slightly different from what we've done in the past. But most importantly too, we have framed it around Part 43. So that privilege expansion is not something that's transportable up into the air transport sector. So it is a good system, but we believe most appropriate for the private and aerial work sectors.
Thanks, Ben. Now there's another person with their hand up, so I'll just let them ask a question and then I'll go back to the chat because there are questions banking up there. So Ruben, would you like to ask your question? Oh. Looks like he's changed his mind. Okay. So we have Ben, is Part 66 licensing system going to continue or be phased out?
I can assure you we have absolutely not considered phasing out Part 66. I recognise that it was a difficult experience for a lot of people. It's a reg set that it does have some positives to it, but like I said before, it is administratively intensive, and it was very much framed around air transport sectors. So since we introduced Part 66, EASA has moved on, trying to find better licensing pathways for GA. We are also active in that space, so we've got a range of initiatives to improve Part 66, but we are certainly intending Part 66 to remain the licensing framework across the board in Australia for a long time.
Okay, so next question. How are the incremental certification privileges for type-rated aircraft going to be recorded on and added to your license?
So that person is correct. You do need to document those expanded privileges, but they are not framed as a license privilege. So this is I hope this is helpful as an explanation, because it's a bit legal. The maintenance rules, like Part 43 or Part 42 or the CARS, they provide a range of maintenance permissions that include, because under the Act, we are required to say who can do maintenance on an aircraft. Some permissions, like maintenance orgs or licenses, you look at a different regulatory part for the standards associated with Casa granting that permission. Other permissions, like maintenance authorities or for Part 43, AMTCs, are embedded in the maintenance rules. The expanded flexibility for LAMEs is not framed as a license privilege, it's a maintenance permission under Part 43. So you have your license with your license privileges described. When you're operating under Part 43, that is the basis of where you start, but you can gain additional privileges that are usable within Part 43. If you also want to go and work in the air transport sectors, those privileges are not automatically available to you. So what we have tried to do is draw a clear line between the flexibility that is good and appropriate for the GA sectors, but maintaining the standards that currently apply to the air transport sectors. So it's a little bit complicated in a legal sense, but really it's just around providing appropriate flexibility for people in those sectors that don't require the same level of administrative and formal training as we would expect for air transport operators. I hope that answers the question.
Sounds like it. Now we'll just go back to Ruben, Ben. He said that he was asking his question, but no one could hear him. So Ruben, are you there?
I hope so.
Oh, good. We can hear you.
Yeah, I think my headset wasn't working. So I'm at the other end of the scale where I work for Cobham Aviation. So we're operating transport category aircraft in aerial work. So I can see that Part 43 is definitely applicable. I know that there are caveats for large aircraft, but it only looks to be for having effectively your SOM remains in effect, like your system of maintenance remains in effect. That's your approved inspection program, and we have to use a 145. What I'm missing is what is the applicable regulations for replacing a maintenance controller, having a maintenance control manual, part requirements to fit to aircraft? Where is that?
Right, okay, so in that continuing airworthiness management space, if you like, it will again depend on what you are intending to do with your aircraft. So if you are a charter operator with an AOC and a head of airworthiness and maintenance control, all of those things still remain in place. If you were a large aircraft private operator, you actually don't need to have those systems in place in terms of a maintenance controller, but you do need to demonstrate that you've got a person assigned to managing that and that you have procedures in place to do it. So those concepts of having a person responsible for managing the continuing airworthiness are embedded in Part 43. For those larger, more complex aircraft, the registered operator has to assign a person to do that function. So all of that remains much the same, potentially a little bit administratively simpler. If you are still making your aircraft available for air transport, then you still have to comply with the current CAR or Part 42 requirements. In terms of fitting parts under Part 43, the current maintenance rules more or less require an authorised release certificate, Form 1, in order to install parts. That is a concept that has been pretty prevalent in Australia. It's not used in every country, so you do not need a Form 1 in New Zealand or the US. Under Part 43, you will not need to have a Form 1 to install a part on an aircraft, but the function of making sure that the part is not an unapproved part and it is the right part, it complies with the data, the approved design for the aircraft, that still needs to be done. So, obviously documentation is still going to be required. It just won't be required that somebody has a Form 1, an authorised release certificate for parts. So the functions remain, but there is more flexibility around how the outcomes can be achieved. Is that sort of a reasonable answer?
Yeah, it does. I think my circumstances are quite unique, and I've got a very long list of questions I'll just email through, I think. But just on that, how does that interact with a 145 then? Because a 145 requires the same paperwork under Part 42 because 145 and 42 align. So we've had this issue before. We have an exemption in our MOE for our 145 to maintain non-Part 42 aircraft. Is that your intention, that we still maintain that type of approach?
What we've done as a baseline is leave 145 alone. So we've received some comments from people around the obvious fact that Part 43 triggers 145 for the more complex maintenance. So in order to maximise the benefits, people are suggesting we should make some of the Part 43 flexibilities available for 145s working on Part 43 aircraft. So in your scenario, based on what we have currently drafted, the 145 would need to comply with its current procedures, which are framed around existing Part 145 rules. We are going to have a look at what we can do to provide flexibility for 145 organisations working under Part 43. And in parallel, we have a range of other improvements we want to make to Part 145, because very much like Part 66, it was framed very much for the air transport sectors, always intended to be made available across the spectrum. We just haven't finished that work yet. So more flexibility is on its way for Part 145 organisations as well. And that's one of the main reasons why we've provided extended transition times for Car 30s, because I'll be the first to admit that it's a pretty big step up from Car 30 to 145 at the moment. We, as a Casa, has got a lot better at doing it. We have a range of one-person 145 approvals out there, so it is scalable. It can be proportionate, but it is also a little bit daunting for your average Car 30 who's operating just fine and has done for many, many years. So point taken, we do need to have a look at what we can do for 145s there and provide some more flexibility. But like 66, there's a bunch of initiatives going on there, and there's only so much we can do under Part 43.
Thanks, Ben.
Fee, I also noticed there was a follow-up question, I think, on the expansion of license privileges. So just to address that again, Alami, who is seeking to expand their privileges under local supervision has to keep records of that. And when they are offering those services to an aircraft operator to do maintenance, the registered operator can ask to see documentation that proves that that LAMI has in fact met the standards to carry out those additional maintenance tasks that aren't necessarily covered by their core license privileges. So, like I said, it's a documented competency-based framework. It's the LAMI's responsibility to keep those records. And if they can't demonstrate that they have those privileges, then they're not eligible to work in that space. And by the way, it's optional. So if as a LAMI you don't feel confident to be working under that framework, you're not required to. You can just work to your core license and do formal training through a Part 147 training organisation and stick to the standard paradigm. The flexibility is not being forced on people who don't want to use it.
Peter, I can see that you've got your hand up and you have had it up for a while. Just bear with me, I'll come back to you while we get through some more questions in the chat. So, Ben, will there be a Casa form or procedure for conducting and assessing task-based competency training?
Mick, have we got a formal template designed for that scenario yet? Or have we lost Mick?
Sorry,
Oh, no,
I was muted. Sorry. We have an advisory circular, I think, that sets out a guidance template, what you could use. But basically, it just means that whenever somebody does a task under supervision of somebody else, they have to record it and record the details of the person who supervised it and the signature. This can be done various ways. It can be done on a printed form or something they've prepared, or they can take photographs every time they've made an entry somewhere and it's been certified by somebody else, providing they can show that they've done the work. They can also take, everybody has a phone these days that takes photos. So if necessary, once they've done it once, because that's one of the other options. If you've already done it once, you can do it again. You can keep a permanent record on your mobile phone.
I suggest you back it up somewhere.
True. But we aim to be flexible with it.
Okay, one more question from the chat and then I'll come to you, Peter. This question, a registered operator operating airwork and transport concurrently, where does she have the aircraft maintained? Under Part 43 or 145 AMO?
Sorry, I just missed the first part of that question.
Okay, I'll ask again. A registered operator operating in airwork and transport concurrently, where does she have their aircraft maintained? Can they do it under Part 43 or can they do it under 145 AMO?
So 145 is available across the board. So that is a default answer for everybody. If an operator sees some business advantage in using something other than a 145, so in particular, if you've got some aircraft that are being used for private and aerial work operations, then they can potentially use a lot more independent LAMIs and IAs with lower cost overheads. But ultimately, they have to be managing the aircraft when they are using it in a different kind of operation. So if it's an aircraft that is mostly used for aerial work and only nominally available for charter, well, maybe there's a business decision to be made there around not making the aircraft available for charter. As an absolute minimum, when the aircraft is going to be released for a charter operation, the registered operator needs to make sure that it complies with the applicable rules. So the answer really is it depends, and there are business decisions to be made around that. If a person is leaving an aircraft available for an air transport operation and it's a charter operation, the car rules will apply, which mostly will trigger a car 30. You can use a 145 if you want. If they are making it available for what used to be RPT, currently scheduled air transport, then Part 42 rules apply, which triggers a 145. So that question really depends on how that person wants to manage their business. But the simple answer is aircraft must comply with the rules for the operation that it's intending to carry out.
Okay, Peter, thank you for waiting. Do you have a question?
Sorry, I just got caught with a phone call then. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, right. So my understanding then from what you've been said and what I've read, and to deal with my questions and comments, we'd be here for about 3 hours, so I won't go into that. From my understanding then, car 30 is going to disappear. Is that correct? Yes or no?
At a high level, yes, because we are transitioning from car to Casa. So
right, yeah. So car 30 is going to disappear because the cars are going to be disappearing and have been disappearing progressively, and you're transitioning to Casas, which
correct.
is what we've been doing for the last 25, 30 years. So anyone who has a car 30 organisation at present will, in the next, after the end of this year, 12 to 36 months, if they don't go to 145, will just basically, it'll fizzle out to nothing. And therefore, aircraft maintained in aerial work and privately will seek to have maintenance done by independent lamies and IAs, which effectively you're saying will replace what was the car 30. However, there is no fixed place of work required for them, and this is where you claim that financial advantage is going to be gained for the operators and so forth. I fail to see how that will be achieved, and I fail to see how it is going to make remote areas more accessible for maintenance under independent lamies and IAs. I also have a problem with, I've inquired about it. At the moment, if you've got a car 30 and an approved system for performing maintenance under an approved maintenance organisation, you can get hangar keepers liability insurance and so forth because you have those processes in place and the approval in place. I've inquired about Casa 43 independent lamey liability insurance, and I've been told by at least one insurer that that is not possible because you don't meet the requirements for insurance. So you really need to explain how this is going to benefit and open up the industry for more activity and more flexibility on the part of licensed engineers, who we suffer already a shortage of that's chronic. I fail to see, I can understand your desire, but I can't see and understand how you can do this for the workings of it.
Right. So there's a lot in that. All right. So I'll try.
Yeah,
and
I know
hit
there's a
some
lot
high
in
points.
that.
By the way, feel free, if you haven't already, we will try to get to other questions if you either post them in the chat or send them through to us separately. The objective, of course, is to reduce business costs through reduced administration. It is obvious that having to apply to Casa and pay fees and pay other people or spend time yourself doing things like writing manuals, getting data contracts in place, making sure you've got facilities available even though you can't use them yet because you haven't got the Casa stamp, all of that costs money. So there is a significant overhead for a small business seeking to become a Casa approved organisation. So like you say, at a high level, it's pretty obvious that there are benefits associated with reducing that administration. We are very mindful that hundreds of people have done that over the years, and we're not looking to drive them out of business. Right? So some choices are going to have to be made by businesses around what these new rules will mean for them. Where do they see themselves going in the future? Where is the business advantage for them? We are doing our very best to make sure that we are minimising the impact on people. So some of the variations that we've created from the FARs are specifically to make sure that we can accommodate existing businesses to continue doing what they do now and have done for many years safely. Stepping up to 145, it is a step up. There are some new elements. So again, we are working a parallel project around how can we make 145 more accessible and less administratively intensive? So I am very sympathetic to what you're saying there, and I acknowledge all of those issues you've raised. In relation to how is this manner likely anticipated to manifest in real benefits? So last time we were up in Darwin, in far north Queensland, people tell us about facilities that they've got out in the regions, but they just can't make the business case to drop $10,000 or $20,000 on Casa fees and contractors to write manuals and have quality assurance systems to do very small business operations. So they believe that this is going to be great for their businesses up there. They will be able to use the facilities they've already got through license holders and license holders who become IAs, and it really suits their business model. So we know that that isn't necessarily a business model that's prevalent in other areas of the country, but for those remote regional areas, we're getting overwhelmingly positive feedback that this will be a significant benefit for them. So, like I say, it's about getting a balance. You know, we know that change means cost. We are therefore trying to provide change at a minimum impact for people and make sure that we are mindful that there are real people on the receiving end of regulatory change, and we are facilitating their transition with as little impact as possible.
Right. Okay. Can I just, if you don't mind, if I could just.
Can I just butt in, Peter? Look, I know that you probably have more questions, but
no
given that the time restraints,
all right.
I would ask that you put them in writing and send them to us, and I will provide you with an email address to do so. Very mindful of the time, so I will try to go back to the chat and see if we can progress through the questions that we have. If we can't get them all, be reassured that we will provide an answer probably tomorrow. So the next question, Ben, is many private experimental category aircraft are currently maintained by non-LAMEs. Under an IA, Instrument of Authority, will this type of instrument approval transfer to an AMTC under the new rules?
Quick short answer is yes. Mick, would you like to add anything to that experimental sector scenario? Mick, are you on mute again?
I was too. Sorry. Yeah, under the current system, under that instrument that we have out there, you have to attend a training course, the maintenance procedures course, in order to maintain your aircraft, and it doesn't entitle you to maintain somebody else's. under the new Part 43, much the same thing will happen, except you won't have to do a course if you built the aircraft. You will just need to satisfy whoever's going to issue the certificate, the C of A for the experimental aircraft, that you know enough to inspect it and make a determination whether or not it's airworthy or not airworthy in a condition for safe flight. Most owner builders will also have the privilege of it maintaining another aircraft. If they sell that one, buy another one that's essentially the same, that will be covered by their AMTC2. The AMTC3 requires a training course as opposed to the two, and that allows you to certify for the condition of an aircraft that you haven't built. And you don't have to own it. Does that answer the question?
I take silence as a yes.
Stands.
Next question. Existing Car 30 C of A holders will potentially lose work clients with lamies carrying IA running around, whilst Car 30 organisations will still have to carry their large overheads to keep approvals and business. So it's really not a question, but a comment. Do you want to respond to that, Ben?
Sure. So that is a potential outcome, but equally, what we've seen in other countries that have adopted this from a bespoke rule set like New Zealand is that it was beneficial for existing businesses as well. The existing businesses have the tools, data, facilities. They have the contracts or contacts with operators. Most people are likely to keep doing what they're doing. So we don't actually envisage a lot of change in the first instance. Most people don't want to run a small business. It's really hard. They'd rather be taking a salary and spending time with their families on the weekend rather than doing business and finishing up the books. So we actually think that in reality, most of the maintenance businesses that currently hold a Car 30 approval will just keep doing what they're doing. There are some choices to be made for that business around, do they want to hand back their Car 30 approval and just work as a business, running a shop with a bunch of lamies who work for a salary and sign out aircraft on their license? Or potentially, do they want to work towards expanding their business in the future, in which case transitioning to a Part 145 would be a good pathway. So one of the issues really is that we have forced a level of administration onto industry and business that international experience shows us does not tangibly increase safety outcomes for smaller, simpler aircraft. So we are lowering the administrative bar. We are looking to provide a smooth transition for existing businesses to the maximum extent possible.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, the next question is, how will the old Car 35, 36 or 21M approved repairs or modification influence the determination of certification basis? How does an IA determine whether they comply?
Right, so obviously when a person is doing the annual inspection, they need to be considering the current state of the aircraft. So the old Car 35, 36 or current 21Ms or any other similar design change needs to be taken into account, and that's written into the rules to make sure that the aircraft in its current configuration complies with its certification basis. So the short answer, in the interest of trying to get to as many questions as we can, it is considered in the rules. The terminology over many years of Australian legislative change is all captured, but the intent obviously is that an IA needs to consider the aircraft and any changes that have been made to that aircraft when they're making their determination.
Okay, thanks, Ben. All right, I'll go to people with their hands up. Chris, you have another question.
Thanks very much. Reading the guidance material for a B2 LAME makes a statement that a B2 LAME can set up a avionics component maintenance workshop without Casa approval. And then they can release that component on the back of a beer coaster, as long as the beer coaster is made out of paper. My concern is that Casa are not reducing the amount of oversight of the industry. They're just walking away from it. And I'm concerned for the safety of what is going to occur in the GA area of the market.
Right, so sure, you're obviously not the person to raise some safety concerns. Like I've tried to explain over the course of this presentation, it's a safe rule set. It's demonstrably safe. So what you described there is exactly what happened in New Zealand. So New Zealand had a bespoke rule set for many years, framed around maintenance organisations. They introduced a car-based system. What they saw was the specialist maintenance providers and what is roughly equivalent to B2 avionics specialists moved into running small businesses around avionics equipment. You don't need a Form 1, which means you don't need a maintenance organisation approval to release those components. The licence demonstrates the competency for that work. They do need to have the tools, data and facilities as one would expect. So it's not, in principle, unsafe. Casa does have a responsibility to oversee industry, and we are working actively with the oversight areas of Casa to make sure that our oversight program is adapted to what we are going to see in the future. So at the moment, we do a lot of systems-based oversight, framed a lot around desktop audits of maintenance organisations. There will be less organisations in the future, so we need to do more of the product-based oversight and surveillance. So yes, I take your point that it is different, but different doesn't necessarily mean unsafe and inappropriate. And it is Casa's responsibility to make sure that our oversight system is appropriate and effective. So all of that has definitely been thought of and is basically being adapted as we speak.
Thanks, Ben. Now, Rowan still has his hand up. Rowan, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. As a private owner and operator of a aircraft, it's only used in private operations is basically where I'm coming from. So two sort of questions. As far as I understand, based on the FARs and our adoption in Part 43, 100 hourlies would no longer be required. Is that correct?
At a high level, yes. And if you are only a private operator now with a small, simple aircraft, you don't need to be doing 100 hourlies now either.
And so we would only need to have our annual inspections. And then it comes to my readings of the plain English draft guide. Under the operator's responsibilities, there's two clauses in there. There's a couple of words in there that I'd like a bit of clarification of. It says ensuring the aircraft is inspected in accordance with the nominated schedule. And it goes on. And then there's another about record keepings that's saying making an entry in the maintenance record stating the inspection schedule applicable to your aircraft. How does an operator go about creating that nominated schedule?
So look, at a high level, that paradigm is exactly what is required now. You, as the registered operator, you have to nominate the maintenance schedule that's applicable for your aircraft, current options, Schedule 5, manufacturers, or a system of maintenance. That needs to be elected by the operator, informed to the maintenance organisation, and then they carry out the relevant maintenance. That's the same high-level paradigm as applicable under the FARs. The registered operator can elect to use the basic MOS Part 43 Schedule 1 annual inspection. They can elect a progressive inspection. They can elect to follow the manufacturer's inspection. So there are similar options available, and as now the registered operator is responsible. They do need to have a record system. There is a little, I suppose, a bit more flexibility around the record, so you don't need to be exclusively using the Casa maintenance release, but in principle, all of those requirements are analogous to what occurs now, and we would expect much the same sort of arrangements to continue.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rowan. Now then, there's 3 more questions, so I think we'll ask the questions and then we'll go into a wrap up. I'm very mindful of time getting away from us. So the next question, will the person who assesses competency need to hold a TAE?
I saw that one pop up. I think that's probably in relation to the expansion of privileges for license holders. So it's important to understand there that the license holder who is supervising the task is not making, they're not making a formal declaration of the other person's competency. They are saying that they did the job under supervision and they did it properly. So it's not the same paradigm as a training organisation. So no, they don't need to have a training approval in order to do that. It is very much the same as supervising a task now. So it's the same paradigm. We're not looking to keep that supervising, we're not looking to impose a legal requirement on the supervising LAMI, other than to say that they supervised the task as they are entitled to do now, and the person did the job properly. So it is different, I would say. This is the thing, is we have had a very formal training organisation-based approval system in Australia for a long time. This new concept is not yet well understood, but like I've said before, on a range of elements of Part 43, it is fundamentally safe, it works. We just need to make sure that us as a regulator and you as industry participants are safely and appropriately adopting these new systems. So I'm very confident that we can do that. I don't like it when people assume it will be unsafe because we can't trust competent industry people to do a good job. At the end of the day, Casa is a regulator. We do safety assurance. We don't do active safety. We're removed from aircraft. We're not on the front line. That's people like you. The reason we have a safe environment is because people like you do a good job every day. And we have great confidence that will continue under Part 43.
Okay, thank you. Next question, how will ag aircraft operating currently under AD-ENG 5 be able to continue on condition?
I've done a bit of talking. Mick, do you want to do the ENG 5 question again?
I'll just make sure I'm off mute.
Yep.
Yes, happy to answer that. Basically, aircraft on the MOS Schedule 1, that's all on condition. So the AD-ENG 5 is telling you that you don't have to do something that you wouldn't have to do anyway if we hadn't said somewhere else that you've got to follow the manufacturer's recommended, and I emphasise recommended maintenance times and procedures. So when a person transfers over to our Part 43, they automatically get they're entitled to just go on condition as long as they comply with airworthiness limitations and the ADs. If it's a more complicated aircraft and they want to keep using their system of maintenance, they can just have that approved as an inspection schedule for Part 43.
I'll add to that as well. There's been a lot of questions about ADNG5 over the last couple of weeks, so I think Fee will probably take that as an item we need to elaborate a little bit more, or at least bring to the surface a bit more with the information we got on the website.
Okay. Now, lucky last, this is more a comment than a question, but I see a risk for existing Car 30 orgs that have a range of customers that are both private and aerial work, which will fall under Part 43, and charter will require a 145. Many or most orgs look after a spread of what will be Part 43 and air transport aircraft, and it is this spread of work that makes their business viable. If the maintenance org transitions to 145 to look after their commercial customers, it's fair to say the financial burden on the business will be higher. However, from a business perspective, they will now have complete with independent LAMI working out of back of Ute to keep their private customers. These pathways don't seem compatible, with the result being either no cost saving for the private aerial work operator, increased cost to the transport operators, or failure of the maintenance business. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Look, this really goes to that same question before around there are changes. At a high level, everybody agrees, from the government, ministers, Senate committees, our board, our executives, our working groups, industry, everybody agrees Casa needs to do better in the GA space, particularly in relation to reduced administrative costs and more proportionate standards. It is really unfortunate that for many years we have maintained a regulatory scheme that leads people to those conclusions, because they're true. We have the most administratively intensive GA maintenance scheme in the world. That's not very good. So everybody agrees we need to do something about that. Doing something about that, however, means change. And we have a lot of people who have different opinions about whether we should change at all and what changes we should make and how those changes should be made. So generally speaking, what that question raised is very true. Right? So people who have businesses that are framed exclusively around private and aerial work operations where under Part 43 a maintenance organisation approval would not be required think this is great. There are a bunch of people looking down from the air transport sectors who are horrified at what they see, because firstly, they're not familiar with what already goes on down in these sectors, and secondly, Part 43 brings in flexibility that is really beneficial for businesses. It does provide relief and more proportionate standards, but as an air transport observer, a lot of people don't think that that is a good thing. Not in terms of relief, but just in terms of safety paradigms and their own safety values. And then there are the people who are stuck in the middle, the ones whose businesses for many years have cut across private aerial work and at least charter. And we know that. We're doing what we can to make sure that the effects on those businesses are minimised and reasonable. We're doing everything we can to provide them pathways into the future. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but we're doing what we can to make it no harder than it can reasonably be. So yes, that is true. If you are stuck in that business paradigm that has eventuated because of the current regulations, there are going to be some choices that need to be made. And I will add again that we are very aware that 145 needs work and needs to be made more scalable and more proportionate for your average Car 30, working out in the regions on your small charter aircraft. We know that, we're working on that. And I know it's a lot to ask you to trust us to do the right thing, but we definitely are aware of that and are doing our very best to move that work forward as well.
Thanks, Ben. So thank you all so much for your participation today. We've gone an hour and a half, so thank you for hanging in there with us. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to put your feedback in and make it count. The Consultation Hub address is on screen. As we mentioned earlier, we do intend to extend the consultation. So if you haven't already submitted your feedback, keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow with more details. We will email you after this session and provide you a copy of today's presentation and any other information that we have drawn to your attention throughout the session. If you do have more questions, please send them in and we will get answers to you as soon as we can. So thank you all very much again and enjoy your evening.